They called him blessed to serve the Emperor among the stars. But in the cockpit's silence, beneath the thunder of war, he learned what that blessing truly cost. The alarms wailed like wounded beasts as Pilot Lieutenant Elias Kale sprinted through the launch bay, flight helmet tucked beneath his arm, the deck vibrating with the distant impacts of orbital fire. The invasion had begun 3 hours earlier, an unexpected strike that caught the system defenses half awake. But Elias hadn't been on alert rotation. He'd been asleep when the sirens began, dreaming of home, of the windswept plains of Javan where his mother's voice still echoed across the long grass. That dream evaporated the moment the call came. All flight wings to stations, priority scramble, this is not a drill. He didn't hesitate. No one did. In the Imperium, hesitation was just another word for death. The bay doors yawned open ahead, revealing rows of lightning interceptors lined up like silver predators beneath the cold lumens. Ground crews swarmed over them, fueling, arming, chanting the litanies of readiness as incense smoke curled through the air. The atmosphere was thick with the mechanical smell of promethium and sacred oils, with the metallic tang of fear. Above the din, the voice of Flight Marshal Dagna barked through the Vox. "Kale, you're in 2-7. Move it." She didn't need to shout. Her words cut through the chaos like a blade. Elias gave a curt nod, breath burning in his lungs as he reached his craft. Lightning 2-7 loomed before him, its nose marked with the sigil of the 143rd Imperial Fighter Wing, a stylized aquila over a burning star. He'd flown her for 7 years. He knew every panel, every scar on her hull, each one earned in dogfights over 100 nameless worlds. For a heartbeat, his gloved hand rested against the cold metal just below the cockpit canopy. Superstition maybe, but every pilot in the 143rd had their rituals before a scramble, and this was his. "You'll hold together," he whispered. "Like always." Then he climbed the ladder 2 steps at a time and dropped into the cockpit, strapping himself in with practiced precision as the canopy sealed with a hiss. The Vox crackled to life. "Control to 2-7, launch in 30, hostiles incoming from high orbit, Emperor watch over you." 2-7 copies, Elias replied, forcing steadiness into his voice. His hands moved automatically over the controls, switching systems from standby to active, engines roaring to life beneath him. The vibrations became part of his heartbeat. The moment the clamps released, the lightning shot down the launch rails and into the star-streaked black. Space opened around him like a wound. The planet below burned in scattered pockets, atmospheric defenses struggling to hold back the invasion. The void ahead glittered with incoming contacts, hundreds of them, green blips that painted a tide of doom across his auspex. At their head, a chaos fleet, jagged and black, marked with the ruinous symbols that made mortal eyes ache to look upon. Elias swallowed hard. He had known fear before, but this was different. This wasn't a skirmish on a fringe world. This was annihilation in the making. "Wing 3, form up on me," came Dagna's voice over the tactical channel. Elias rolled his lightning into position, slotting neatly between veteran pilot Corvin on his right and rookie Jasta on his left. He could hear Jasta's breathing over the Vox, fast, shallow. The boy was barely out of training, sent to the front because the Imperium always needed more bodies. "Keep tight," Elias said quietly, not for himself but for Jasta. "Stay on my wing and follow my lead. We'll see dawn together." He didn't know if that was a promise or a lie. The Chaos Fighters appeared as shadows against the stars, needle-shaped craft that moved with impossible agility like predators tasting blood. The first exchange came fast. Lances of green energy cut through the void, and the Imperial formation scattered, rolling and diving as fire licked at their contrails. Elias pulled hard to port, feeling the G-forces crush against his ribs. Corvin's voice came sharp. "Kale, 2 on your tail." He flipped the lightning into a corkscrew maneuver, guns blazing, tracers carving golden arcs through space. One pursuer exploded in a gout of unnatural flame, its death marked by a scream that somehow echoed through the Vox like a chorus of the damned. The other clung close. Jasta tried to break formation to help, but Elias barked, "Hold formation, damn it." His voice cracked, harsher than he intended but necessary. The rookie hesitated, then obeyed. Elias dove toward the planet's upper atmosphere, luring the Chaos craft into a tightening spiral. The Lightning's engines screamed in protest, temperature gauges edging into the red, but Elias knew this dance. He cut thrust at the apex of the turn, letting the enemy overshoot, then reignited full burn. The maneuver slammed him against the seat, but his guns found their mark, and the Chaos fighter disintegrated into molten fragments that trailed fire into the sky below. For a moment, exhilaration flooded him. Not victory. Imperial pilots didn't have the luxury of believing in victory, but survival. And then the Vox filled with a scream. "Corvin's hit," Jasta shouted. Elias snapped his head right in time to see Corvin's lightning spiral out of control, a plume of fire trailing from its wing. The veteran didn't eject. There was no point. The Chaos capital ship's flak batteries found him first, vaporizing the lightning in a flare of light. Just like that, 20 years of service ended in silence. Elias clenched his jaw. There was no time to mourn. "Form up, tighten the net," Dagna commanded, her own fighter spearing through enemy lines like a comet. The battle raged in brutal, chaotic surges. Squadrons dissolved and reformed. Pilots died without names. Elias lost track of how many kills he scored, how many close calls left his heart hammering. Through it all, Jasta clung to his wing like a shadow, raw talent barely contained by fear. And then, amid the fury, the enemy flagship silhouette filled his cockpit view, a colossal vessel whose prow was shaped like a screaming face, its mouth open to vomit boarding torpedoes toward the planet below. Elias felt the chill of true dread then, deeper than any dogfight could give. The realization came slow but unstoppable. This wasn't just a raid. This was planetary conquest, and the Imperial defense lines were already fracturing. "Command, this is 2-7, he voxed. "Flagship sighted, bearing 039, range 90 clicks. It's launching torpedoes." 2-7, hold position. Interceptor wing 6 is redirecting. The transmission cut into static. Elias' auspex flared red with new contacts. Torpedoes, dozens of them, burning through void and atmosphere alike toward the planetary hives. He didn't think. He acted. "Jasta with me," he snapped. "We're intercepting." "Sir, that's suicide." "Then fly fast." They dove together, engines howling, leaving the rest of the wing behind. Each torpedo was the size of a hab block, loaded with traitor Marines and their foul war machines. If they made landfall, the cities below would drown in blood. Elias lined up his guns, targeting systems screaming as he unleashed everything 2-7 had. The first torpedo detonated in a chain reaction that lit the sky like a false dawn. Shrapnel slammed against his hull, alarms blaring. The second torpedo was closer now. He fired again. Missiles streaked past, scoring hits but not enough. "Emperor, damn it!" He dove lower, bringing the lightning so close he could see the torpedo's armor plating buckle. Jasta's voice cracked over the Vox. "I can finish it. I have a clear shot." "Break off, that's an order." "Sir." The explosion was blinding. The torpedo went up in a fiery blossom, and through the glare Elias saw Jasta's lightning engulfed by the shockwave, spinning away in pieces. Static filled the channel where his voice had been. Elias' stomach lurched. He wanted to scream. There was no time. Another wave of torpedoes descended. His auspex painted a hopeless picture, too many targets, too little time. And above it all, the flagship's guns turned slowly toward him, like the gaze of a predator fixing on prey. His warning klaxons erupted, filling the cockpit with their shrill chorus. In that frozen heartbeat, Elias Kale understood why Imperial pilots called their existence doomed. It wasn't just the enemy. It was the endlessness of it all. The sky would always burn. The war would never end. And still they flew. The sky turned into a furnace. Plasma beams lanced through the upper atmosphere, painting streaks of searing blue-white across the heavens as the Chaos flagship opened fire in earnest. Elias jerked the lightning into a violent roll just as a blast sheared through the space he'd occupied seconds before, the shockwave rattling his teeth. The auspex howled its warning, a rising chorus of doom that no pilot could ever grow accustomed to. His heart hammered against his chest as the world narrowed to the dim cockpit lights, the targeting reticles, the red warnings blooming like poisonous flowers on every display. He didn't have time to mourn Jasta, not here, not now. The boy's death was another brief flare extinguished in the void, one of thousands that would follow before this day was done. His comms flickered to life amid static. 2-7, regroup at rally point Seta, you're off formation. Dagna's voice cut through the storm like a whip. Negative, Marshal, Elias snapped back, pulling hard into a dive that scorched his craft's heat shielding. Multiple torpedo contacts inbound planetary, no interceptors left in range. I'm cutting them off. There was a pause, then the Marshal's voice returned, quieter, edged with something between fury and reluctant admiration. Emperor's blood, Kale, do what you can. Emperor be with you. The channel closed, leaving only the crackle of interference and the omnipresent roar of the engines. Below him, the atmosphere burned. Dozens of massive torpedoes plummeted toward the planetary hives, leaving contrails of flame as they broke through the upper layers. Elias gritted his teeth. Each one carried a warbend, a payload of corruption that would detonate not merely in explosive power, but in the opening of warp-tainted rifts that would bleed horror into the streets. If they landed, the planet would drown in screams. He dove after them like a falcon hunting prey, every muscle straining as gravity and velocity conspired to tear his craft apart. His targeting system struggled to keep pace with the torpedo's descent. He selected one, aimed at Hive Acheron, a sprawling industrial city where 20 million souls lived in stacked towers of rusted steel, and let loose a barrage of missiles. The sky bloomed with fire as two struck home, rupturing the torpedo's midsection. A secondary explosion ripped it apart, debris scattering like burning meteors. Cheers echoed faintly through the local defense Vox channels, but Elias didn't hear them. His eyes were already scanning for the next target. The second torpedo was lower, faster, and shielded by its fellows. He pushed the lightning to its limits, heat alarms blaring. The cockpit grew sweltering, sweat rolling down his temples. The engine's whine climbed into an almost panicked scream as he forced the craft into a steep intercept course. Every pilot knew the sensation, the thin edge between mastery and death, between pulling off the impossible and disintegrating into a streak of molten wreckage. He lined up the shot and fired, autocannons blazing. Shells hammered into the torpedo's aft, shredding control fins. It veered wildly, destabilized, then detonated in the dense air with a thunderclap that shook the clouds. 2 down, he muttered through clenched teeth. Emperor, help me. The third was nearly beyond reach, and with it came the realization that he couldn't possibly destroy them all. There were too many. The auspex filled with descending targets like a plague. Interceptor Wing 6 was gone, scattered, or dead. Planetary defense batteries were overwhelmed, and overhead the Chaos Fleet loomed like a storm front, inexorable and infinite. For a heartbeat, Elias felt a cold clarity settle over him. He was a single man in a machine, hurtling through skies that belonged to the enemy now. There was no reinforcement coming, no miracle, only him and the impossible. He pushed the lightning into a punishing climb, banking toward the torpedo's path. If he couldn't destroy them all, he'd destroy the ones that mattered most. Hive Mornax lay beneath that third torpedo, a place he knew. Not well, but well enough to remember the endless rows of hab stacks in Manufactoria where he'd once walked on shore leave. He remembered the smell of fried starch cakes from a vendor's stall. He remembered a girl with black hair who'd laughed when he'd stumbled trying to impress her. That hive was real. It was full of lives and voices and places that made the endless war feel, briefly, like something human still existed. He couldn't let it burn. The torpedo's icon grew larger on his display, the range falling fast. He armed his last pair of missiles and waited for the tone. The targeting computer screamed its lock confirmation. He fired. Twin contrails streaked through the sky, impacting dead center. For a second, nothing happened. Then the torpedo cracked in half, exploding in a rolling fireball that turned the clouds orange. A shockwave slammed into his lightning, flipping it end over end. Elias fought the stick, muscles straining as the world spun. Altitude plummeted. His vision tunneled. For a terrible moment, he thought this was it, that his story would end here as another pilot lost in the smoke and fury of war. Then the engines caught, stabilizers biting into the air, and he leveled out a kilometer above the hive's outer spires. Below, millions of lights flickered across the hive's surface as air raid sirens wailed. He caught glimpses of panicked crowds flooding the walkways and transit lines, the faceless mass of humanity trying to flee from something they couldn't understand. His chest ached. He knew he'd saved them for now, but he also knew more torpedoes were coming. And the Chaos Fleet hadn't even begun its ground assault. 2-7, came a new voice on the Vox, harsh and desperate. This is ground control Mornax. We have confirmed torpedo strikes on Hive's Calderon and Erithas. Warp signatures detected. They're in. Elia's stomach dropped. How bad? Bad? There was silence, then a low, ragged exhalation. The sky is tearing. We need air cover, anything you can give. He banked hard, climbing again toward the upper atmosphere, the darkness above stained by distant plasma fire. He wanted to answer, to offer hope, but what could he say? He was one man, one fighter, against a nightmare pouring through the cracks of reality. He switched channels to the wing frequency. Silence greeted him. The 143rd had been shattered. No voices, no orders, just static. As he rose through the turbulent clouds, the Chaos Fleet came into view again, silhouetted against the stars like a jagged wound. Dropships were beginning to launch in waves, black shapes that looked almost alive as they dove toward the planet. They were too many. His breath caught, a shiver running through him despite the heat. He thought of Javan then, the plains, the wind, his mother's voice. He wondered if she'd still recognize him after all these years, if he'd changed too much beneath the Emperor's banners. Kale, Dagna's voice cut suddenly through the static. She sounded strained, breathless. If you're still alive, fall back to Station Aegis. We're regrouping what's left of the wing. Repeat, fall back. Marshal, enemy landing craft are inbound. If we don't intercept. Kale, that's an order. Her voice cracked into something raw. You can't stop them alone. He hesitated, glancing at the dropship streaking below. She was right, but turning away felt like betrayal. Every pilot knew this war was unwinnable, but abandoning those hives to their fate was another kind of death. His hands hovered over the controls. The alarms blared again, more urgently this time. A fresh wave of fighters was inbound, traitor craft, sleek and cruel, closing on his position. Emperor, forgive me, he whispered, banking toward Station Aegis. The station hung in low orbit like a battered shield, its once-proud bastion scorched and cratered by enemy fire. What remained of the defense fleet clustered around it, frigates belching smoke, cruisers firing on failing power reserves. As he approached, a formation of surviving lightnings fell into loose escort beside him, their hulls scarred, their wings pitted with debris impacts. Familiar call signs flickered on his auspex. Dagna, Renlo, Ser, survivors. Kale, glad to see you, Renlo voxed, his voice hoarse. Thought you bought it down there. Not yet, Elias replied. What's the situation? Grim, Dagna's tone left no room for interpretation. They hit us harder than command predicted. Half the wing's gone. Orbital guns are down to 30%. The next wave breaks through, we lose the station. Elias swallowed hard. The weight of it pressed against him, as heavy as the crushing G-forces of a dive. Around him, the last defenders of the 143rd circled like weary hawks, their numbers a fraction of what they'd been hours ago. Below, the planet burned. Above, the enemy gathered for the killing blow. In that suspended moment, Elias Kale felt the shape of his fate closing around him like the jaws of some vast, unseen predator. A doomed existence, yes, but one he would meet with teeth bared. The proximity alarms shrieked. New contacts, dozens, then hundreds. The second wave was coming. The second wave came like a tide of fire and steel, blotting out the stars. Ilia's auspex flooded with hostile signatures, each one a dagger pointed toward the heart of the defense line. Chaos fighters surged ahead of the dropships, their engines screaming like living things, their formations loose and predatory. Station Aegis stirred to life in response, defense turrets grinding, macro batteries thundering, fighters scrambling from half-ruined launch bays. It was like watching a battered beast rouse itself for a final, desperate stand. Ilias sat rigid in his cockpit, hands tight on the controls as his lightning slotted into the defensive formation alongside Dagna, Renlo, and Sayre. There was no room for speeches, no rousing declarations. Everyone here knew what they were facing. The void ahead was death, and they were flying straight into its mouth. Wing 3, intercept pattern Gamma, Dagna's voice crackled over the Vox, steady despite the chaos. Priority is to keep those dropships off the station. If they breach the docks, it's over. Ilias toggled his response. 2-7 copies, Gamma pattern. They dove into the enemy formation head-on. The first pass was a blur of cannon fire and blazing contrails. Ilias locked onto a twisted Hellblade fighter, its fuselage smeared with demonic runes that writhed even through the targeting optics. He squeezed the trigger and watched his autocannons tear into its wing, shredding metal and flesh alike, until it blossomed into a sphere of black fire. He rolled to avoid the explosion, pulling a tight loop that sent his lightning screaming back into the melee. All around him, the void was alive with destruction. Flak bursts bloomed like deadly flowers. Tracer fire crisscrossed the blackness. A dropship exploded under concentrated turret fire, spilling burning debris across the stars. But for every enemy destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The Chaos Fleet had committed its strength now, and the Imperial defenders were being ground down under the weight of it. "Renlo, you've got a tail," Ilias snapped, catching the glint of an enemy fighter closing in behind his wingmate. He swung around, engines howling, and let loose a burst that sliced through the pursuer's cockpit. Renlo pulled away with a hiss. "Thanks, Kale. Oh, you won." "Just stay alive," Ilias shot back. A massive tremor shook the formation as the Chaos Fleet's bombardment intensified. Plasma beams stabbed down toward Station Aegis, hammering its void shields. The energy barriers flared brilliant blue, flickered, then held, but barely. The station returned fire with every gun it could still bring to bear, lashing out in a defiant storm of macro shells and lance strikes. For a moment it was almost beautiful, the furious exchange of light across the dark, like gods hurling spears. But beauty had no place here. Every hit the station took brought it closer to ruin, and Ilias could hear the grim inevitability in the clipped reports coming through the Vox. Shield capacitors at 60%. Port turrets offline. Docking ring compromised. Containment breach on deck 42. And through it all, the dropships kept coming. Ilias peeled away from the furball, climbing to get a better angle on the nearest wave of landers. There were too many. He picked one, fired a missile, and watched it vanish in a burst of plasma. Another slipped past. 2 more followed, weaving through flak like sharks through a net. "Dagna," he voxed, "they're breaking through." "I see it," she replied grimly. "We're thinning out too fast." He glanced at his auspex. Half their wing was gone already. The survivors were scattered, some fighting alone against entire squadrons, others desperately trying to cover the station's weak points. There was no cohesion left, just fragments of bravery holding the line. Then the first dropship struck the station. The impact rippled through the void like a bell tolling. Alarms blared across every channel. "Breach detected in Dock 7, someone shouted. "Boarding parties incoming." Ilia's stomach twisted. Once the traitors were inside, the fight would turn into a blood-soaked labyrinth of corridors and bulkheads, and Station Aegis was already stretched thin. He saw it then, an opportunity, razor-thin and reckless. A cluster of dropships was closing on Dock 8, escorted by a flight of hellblades. If he cut through fast enough, if he hit them before they reached the hull, he might cripple the wave before it landed. It was madness, but madness was all that was left. He rolled his lightning into a steep dive, engine screaming. Tracer fire whipped past his canopy, close enough to make the cockpit vibrate. He ignored it, focused on the dropships ahead. Targeting run locked. Missile bays armed. His breath came slow and steady, the world shrinking to the reticle in front of him. He fired everything. The missiles streaked forward like vengeful spirits, slamming into the lead dropship. It exploded in a dazzling flare, taking its escort with it. Elias shot through the fireball, close enough that the heat made the canopy glow red. He pulled up hard, but not fast enough. The shockwave slammed into his craft, throwing alarms into a frenzy. "Kale, pull up," Dagna's voice cracked over the Vox. He yanked the stick, muscles screaming, and the lightning clawed its way back toward open space. Hull integrity warnings flashed red. He ignored them. Below, the remaining dropships scattered in disarray. 2 more were picked off by turret fire before they could recover. Dock 8 held for now. Elias let out a shaky breath. His hands were trembling. He barely had time to steady himself before new alarms began to wail. His auspex bloomed with fresh contacts, bigger, slower, radiating warp signatures like beacons. "Marshal," he voxed, his voice tight, "what are those?" Dagna didn't answer immediately. When she did, her tone was grim. "Warp breach ships. They're opening gates. If they make it to low orbit, this whole sector turns into a demon pit." A chill swept through Elias despite the heat of the cockpit. He'd heard of breach ships. Their purpose wasn't to land troops, but to punch holes between reality and the warp itself, allowing demons to flood through. Even one reaching orbit could doom the planet below. "Can we stop them?" he asked. "Not with what we've got left," Dagna replied, "but we're going to try." Her orders crackled over the Vox, rallying the scattered fighters. What remained of the 143rd Wing and several station defense squadrons swung toward the breach ships. It was a suicidal move. Everyone knew it, but no one hesitated. The breach ships were enormous, bloated things that looked less like starships and more like tumors grafted onto the void. They moved slowly, inexorably, surrounded by escorts. Warp lightning arced across their hulls. Elias felt the wrongness radiating from them even through his cockpit, a pressure on his mind that made his skin crawl. The first attack run was chaos. Fighters dove in, guns blazing, missiles streaking toward the nearest breach ship. Its escorts retaliated with murderous ferocity, filling space with deadly fire. Ships exploded in every direction. Elias locked onto one of the breach ship's exposed vents, fired a missile, and watched it vanish into the swirling warp light with no effect. "Targeting isn't sticking," Renlo shouted. "They're shielded," Dagna barked back. "Hit the conduits, the conduits." Elias adjusted, scanning for weak points. There, along the underbelly, pulsing with unnatural light. He dove toward it, weaving through enemy fire, and let loose a burst from his autocannons. The rounds punched through and the light flickered violently. He saw a dozen fighters follow suit, hammering the same spot. The breach ship convulsed, a ripple of warp energy bursting from its hull. Then something screamed through the void. It wasn't Vox interference. It wasn't mechanical. It was a sound that reached inside his skull and twisted. Elias nearly blacked out, his vision blurred. When he came to, half the attack wave was gone, either scattered or torn apart by invisible forces. The breach ship was still coming. Station Aegis began firing its lance batteries, desperate to bring the abomination down. Brilliant beams stabbed through space, tearing into the breach ship's side. This time something gave. The massive vessel shuddered, splitting down the middle as its warp core destabilized. For a heartbeat, Elias felt a flicker of triumph. Then it exploded. The blast wasn't like a normal ship's death. It was a ripple in reality, a bloom of warp fire that washed over everything nearby. Elias' lightning was tossed like a leaf in a hurricane. Systems flickered. His ears rang. Through the disorienting whirl, he caught glimpses of other fighters spinning out of control, of a frigate vanishing into the warp flare, of the breached ship's wreckage writhing like something alive as it died. When his vision cleared, he was alone. The battle was still raging somewhere around the station, but his auspex was fried, his comms sputtering. Static and distant screams filled the channels. He steadied his breathing, trying to regain bearings. The stars swam slowly back into focus, but in the distance, beyond the chaos, he saw more breached ships advancing. The first had been only the beginning. And in that cold, silent moment, Elias Kale understood. This wasn't just a battle. This was the unmaking of a world. Elias drifted through the wreckage like a ghost, the once familiar void around Station Aegis now twisted into something unrecognizable. Fragments of ships tumbled silently, their surfaces scorched and bent like paper crushed in a giant's hand. A dead frigate rotated slowly nearby, its broken spine venting frozen atmosphere into space like a bleeding wound. The breached ship's detonation had left a scar in reality itself. A shimmering rift still pulsed faintly where it had died, like a festering sore in the fabric of the void. His lightning's cockpit flickered in and out, the machine's spirits within struggling to recover from the warp blast. He slammed the side console with his fist, muttering a prayer to the Omnissiah through gritted teeth. The machine answered slowly. First the auspex came back, then partial comms, then the artificial horizon stabilized. A low whine vibrated through the hull like a wounded animal's cry, but she still flew. That was enough. The Vox sputtered, resolving into a cracked, static-filled voice. Is Dagna, all surviving elements regroup, ZZZZK, defensive perimeter, breached ships advancing, Kale, do you copy? Marshal, Elias rasped, leaning into the mic. I hear you. Systems are damaged, but I'm operational. Where's the wing? Scattered, she replied bluntly. What's left of us is rallying on the station's dark side. We lost Sayre. Renlo's fighter is venting, but he's alive. Kale, we can't hold much longer. Her voice carried a weight Elias hadn't heard before. Not the usual hard-edged command tone, but something fraying at the edges, exhausted and raw. He didn't blame her. This wasn't a battle anyone was meant to survive. I'm on my way, he said, pulling the lightning around. His engines coughed, then roared reluctantly to life. He sped through the debris field, weaving between shattered hulls and drifting bodies. At one point he caught a glimpse of a lone pilot's corpse still strapped in a half-destroyed cockpit, face frozen in a silent scream. He looked away quickly. When he crested the shadowed limb of Station Aegis, his heart clenched. The defensive perimeter Dagna had mentioned was barely a formation. Half a dozen battered fighters and 2 gunships hovering near the station's mangled bastions. Beyond them, the enemy fleet was closing in, breached ships lumbering forward like bloated carrion beasts surrounded by swarms of chaos fighters. The void between was lit by the dying flashes of the station's remaining defense guns. Kale, Renlo's voice broke through the Vox as Elias slid into formation. Emperor's mercy, you made it. Thought the warp swallowed you. Not yet, Elias answered, scanning the growing swarm ahead. What's the plan? Dagna cut in, her voice clipped and hoarse. Plan. Survive long enough to buy the planet below a few more minutes. There's no reinforcement coming. Fleet command is gone. Ground batteries are failing. We're the last line. The words hung there like a death sentence, but no one argued. They all knew. Elias exhaled slowly, feeling the cold, focused clarity settle over him again. There was no room for fear anymore, just purpose. The breached ships moved closer. Warp lightning arced across their swollen hulls. Their escorts fanned out ahead, hundreds of twisted fighters like a plague of locusts. Elias' auspex struggled to even display them all at once. Wing, Dagna barked. Target priority is the lead breach ship. Hit it hard, hit it fast. Don't get drawn into dogfights, you'll die tired. Kale, you're with me on the spear point. Renlo, cover our flanks. Emperor, be with us. Elias adjusted his formation and followed Dagna into the void. The two lightnings streaked forward, their engines blazing, cutting through the chaos like knives. Enemy fighters peeled toward them immediately. Tracer fire slashed through the dark. Elias rolled hard, a hellblade screaming past his canopy before disintegrating under Dagna's cannons. The breach ship loomed larger with every second. Its hull was a grotesque patchwork of metal and flesh, writhing with veins of warp energy. It pulsed like a living organ, its presence pressing against Elias' mind with a sickening rhythm. He locked onto the same conduit weak point they discovered earlier and fired a missile. It struck true, but the breach ship barely shuddered. Dagna, its shields are stronger than the last one, Elias shouted. I see it, she hissed. Keep hitting the same point, break through or die trying. They dove again, autocannons blazing. Around them, the other fighters joined in, hammering the breach ship's underside. Sections of its hull began to rupture, spewing out thick clouds of warp-tainted gas. The escorts swarmed like hornets, and the sky turned into a storm of death. Elias clipped a hellblade with a wild burst, sending it spiraling into its comrades, but another swung in behind him almost immediately. Warning klaxons filled his cockpit. He jerked the lightning into a savage barrel roll, pulling hard on the stick until his vision narrowed into a tunnel. The enemy overshot, and Renlo appeared from nowhere, cutting it down in a clean burst. Got your tail, Renlo voxed, strained but alive. Remind me to buy you a drink if we live through this, Elias shot back. They regrouped near the breach ship's flank, only to be rocked by a sudden, gut-deep vibration. Elias glanced right just in time to see Station Aegis take a direct hit. One of the breach ships had unleashed a warp discharge, a swirling beam of raw unreality that punched straight through the station's void shields. The entire central bastion erupted into fire. Metal twisted. Massive chunks of the station began drifting away like dying embers. Decks 30 through 60 are gone, someone screamed over the Vox. Evacuation protocols failing. We can't contain, the voice cut off in static. Elia's stomach twisted painfully. That was where the civilian tech crews had been stationed. He forced himself to look away. He couldn't afford to carry every death right now. There would be time, if he survived, to remember them. Kale, Dagna's voice snapped him back. New contacts, high-energy spikes. They're opening the gates. Elias whipped his gaze forward. The breach ship's hulls split open like rotten fruit, revealing swirling cores of warp energy. Rifts began to bloom in space, dark, pulsating tears that bled unnatural light. The air around the lightning seemed to grow colder, heavier. And then the first demons came through. They were not ships. They were shapes, colors, and horrors that defied clear perception. Some resembled winged beasts of bone and flame. Others were formless shadows that slithered through the void like smoke given malevolent intent. The station's guns opened fire, but reality itself seemed to bend around the creatures. They slipped through flak bursts like water. Panic flared across the Vox. Demonic incursion, Emperor preserve us. Elias swallowed hard. This was it. The true assault had begun. Everything before this had been a prelude. Dagna's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. All wings, focus fire on the breach ship cores. If we can collapse the rifts, we might buy time. Do not engage the entities unless you have no choice. Elias followed her into another dive. The breach ship's core glowed like a miniature sun, swirling violently as the rift widened. He fired everything he had left, autocannons, missiles, even emergency flare charges. Explosions ripped across the hull, and for a brief moment the rift faltered. But the breach ships were too many, and they were opening faster than they could close them. One collapsed, only for two more to tear open beside it. A massive winged demon the size of a gunship erupted into real space, its scream echoing inside Elias' skull like a spike of ice. He flinched involuntarily, losing formation for a moment before forcing himself back into control. "Renlo!" Dagna shouted suddenly. Elias turned just in time to see Renlo's lightning engulfed by a swarm of smaller creatures. They clung to his hull like insects, chewing through metal with unnatural speed. His voice was a choked scream over the vox before his fighter exploded in a bloom of fire. Elias felt the shock like a punch to the chest. Renlo, loud, reckless Renlo, was gone in an instant. There was no time to mourn. Dagna was screaming new orders, enemy fighters were closing in, and the breach ships kept advancing. He locked onto the nearest breach core and dove again, not because he thought they could win, but because there was nothing else to do. Because in this place, at this moment, purpose was the only thing keeping the void from swallowing him whole. As his lightning plunged into the maelstrom of warp fire and tracer rounds, Elias realized with cold clarity that the battle wasn't about victory anymore. It was about how long they could hold the darkness back before it consumed everything. And he intended to hold until the very last breath left his body. The void had become a living nightmare. Elias' lightning screamed through the shifting chaos as reality itself buckled and folded under the pressure of the warp incursions. Rifts bled impossible light, bending shadows into shapes that shouldn't exist, and the airwaves filled with the cacophony of overlapping vox transmissions, orders, prayers, screams, static, until the words blurred into a single collective howl. The breach ships had finished opening their cores, and now demons flooded through them like a tide unbound. They swarmed toward Station Aegis, with the hunger of wolves scenting blood. Elias dove beneath the drifting carcass of a burning gunship, pulling a hard roll to avoid a lance of warp energy that sliced through where he'd been a moment before. His cockpit was bathed in flashing red from warning runes, coolant pressure failing, starboard wing damage, missile racks empty. But the lightning still held together, rattling like a creature that knew it was dying but refused to collapse. Ahead of him, Dagna's fighter traced tight spirals through the dark, her weapons systems firing in precise, disciplined bursts that shredded a pair of incoming hellblades before they could get close. "Kale, stay tight," she barked through the vox, her voice hoarse and ragged. "We push on the third breach ship. That one's the keystone. If it collapses, maybe, just maybe, we slow the flood." He didn't answer with words, only banked closer to her tail, locking into formation like muscle memory. The third breach ship loomed ahead, its hull writhing with veins of light, its core pulsing brighter than the others. Around it, a swarm of demonic entities coiled through the void. Some resembled grotesque parodies of human forms, limbs elongated, mouths split wide with rows of glassy teeth, while others were formless energy clouds that seemed to phase in and out of existence. The auspex struggled to categorize them, glitching between impossible readings and corrupted data streams. The surviving wing tightened their formation. There weren't many of them left now. A pair of battered thunderbolts, a single gunship whose dorsal cannon still spat fire despite half its hull hanging open, and Elias and Dagna in their lightnings. That was all. The rest were gone, burned, broken, or consumed by the rift-born horrors. Yet in that broken little cluster of humanity's machines, there was something defiant, almost holy. They moved like a single organism, battered but unyielding. "Gunner team on the gunship, you're our shield," Dagna snapped. "Draw their fire. Thunderbolts cut a path. Kale and I will hit the core. Hit it like it's the last thing you'll ever do." Static crackled, followed by a gunner's grim laughter. Martial at this point it might be. They accelerated. The breach ship grew immense, its form distorting perspective until it filled the canopy like a black sun. The swarm reacted, streaking toward them with unnatural speed. A thunderbolt vanished instantly, impaled on a spear of living light. The gunship's cannons roared, tearing into the creatures, buying precious seconds. Elias locked onto the core conduit, his targeting system screaming in protest as warp interference distorted everything. He forced the crosshairs steady, muscles straining. Missiles away, Dagna's too. The projectiles streaked toward the breach ship like vengeful stars. Demonic entities swarmed to intercept, but several struck true, detonating against the core's outer casing. The breach ship shuddered violently. For a heartbeat, Elias saw the rift destabilize, its edges fraying like torn cloth. "Again!" Dagna shouted. Elias gritted his teeth. He had nothing left to fire except his autocannons, their ammunition nearly spent. He dove low, skimming along the breach ship's hull, firing short, brutal bursts into the weak point. The breach ship retaliated, arcs of warp lightning lashing out like the tendrils of some colossal deep-sea creature. One struck the gunship. The explosion was instantaneous, an expanding ball of fire and wreckage that illuminated the void like a second sun. "Gunship S gone," someone screamed on Vox. But the distraction had worked. Dagna slammed another missile into the core. The breach ship convulsed as its rift destabilized further, the pulsing light flickering erratically. For the first time, Elias dared to believe they might actually bring it down. Then the thunderbolt on his left disintegrated. One moment it was there, the next it was torn in half by a winged demon larger than any fighter. The creature's claws sliced through the fuselage as if it were parchment, sending flaming debris spinning into Elias' path. He rolled violently, metal scraping metal as fragments grazed his wing. His cockpit flooded with alarms. "Kale," Dagna's voice was sharp, pulling him back. "Stay on target." He swallowed down the panic, refocused. The breach ship was faltering now, its hull splitting open, warp energy bleeding out uncontrolled. But the enemy knew what they were doing. More demons poured out, converging on their position like a living net closing around prey. A clawed shadow swept across his canopy, and for a split second Elias saw the demon's face, an eyeless maw, rows of crystalline fangs, skin like molten brass. It dove for him. He jerked the stick back, barely avoiding its talons, feeling the lightning shudder as the turbulence rattled through the fuselage. "Kale, break right," Dagna shouted. He obeyed instantly, veering away from the breach ship as Dagna dove straight toward the demon swarm. Her lightning flared like a comet, guns blazing, missiles streaking. She was buying him time, drawing their attention away from the core so he could line up the final strike. Elias clenched his jaw. His last autocannon belt rattled into place. There would be no second chance. He angled downward, hugging the breach ship's underbelly, weaving through spurts of warp energy and tumorous growths until the core conduit filled his view. "In the Emperor's name," he whispered, though he didn't know if it was a prayer or a curse. He opened fire. Every shell struck true, slamming into the breach ship's core like hammer blows. The structure cracked, warped energy spilling out in wild arcs. Dagna added her fire from above. Together, their assault reached a critical crescendo, and then the breach ship erupted, not in fire but in light. A blinding, soundless explosion of warp energy that rippled outward, shredding nearby demons and collapsing the rift in on itself. The shockwave hurled Elias lightning end over end, alarms shrieking. His head slammed against the cockpit frame, stars bursting behind his eyes. When his vision cleared, he saw the breach ship's remains drifting apart, its core gone, its rift sealed. A hole had been punched into the enemy line, a small one, temporary but real. The Vox was a mess of overlapping cheers, sobs, and static, but Dagna's voice cut through, fierce and commanding. "We did it. Emperor's Light, we did it. All surviving units regroup. Station Aegis still stands for now." Elias looked around. The swarm was still there. The remaining breach ships still pulsed, their rifts still bleeding horrors into real space. The enemy fleet was still closing, but for one brief, miraculous moment they had struck back. They had hurt the enemy. He felt something rise in his chest, not hope exactly, but something sharper, fiercer, defiance. Then a new signal lit up his auspex. Large, fast-moving, multiple contacts. His blood ran cold as he read the identifier codes. Not more fighters, not demons. Drop pods. Hundreds of them. They were descending from the enemy fleet, aimed straight for the planet below and Station Aegis. The real invasion was beginning. Elia's hands tightened on the controls. The breach ships had been only the prelude. Now came the storm. "Marshal," he voxed, voice low, "we've got incoming, lots of it." Dagna's reply was a grim exhale, "Then we keep fighting." And as the first pods hit the upper atmosphere in trails of burning light, Elias understood that their small victory was only a heartbeat in a much longer death. But he would spend that heartbeat well. The drop pods tore through the upper atmosphere like burning meteors, hundreds of them streaking down in great, fiery arcs that split the darkness. From orbit, Elias could see their descent clearly, a swarm of iron seeds hurled toward the wounded Earth, each carrying the promise of slaughter. His cockpit shuddered as the turbulence from the atmospheric boundary hit, the lightning's frame groaning under the pressure. Below, the planet's night side was lit not by stars, but by the distant flashes of surface batteries firing skyward, desperate lines of defense clawing at the void. The Vox was alive with frantic voices. Imperial Guard commanders shouting coordinates, Station Aegis defense officers reporting breaches, pilots calling for resupply that wouldn't come. The chaos wasn't just external anymore. It seeped into the fabric of their communications, a storm of overlapping desperation. Through it all, Dagna's voice cut in like a scalpel, steady, sharp, unyielding. "All wings break and harass the pods. Don't let them land unchallenged. Every second we buy counts." Elias rolled the Lightning into a steep dive, chasing the falling pods. The heat shields glowed crimson from atmospheric entry, but the pods didn't slow. These weren't standard Imperial deployment capsules. They were chaos-forged, their hulls twisted with sigils that pulsed faint warp light, and they burned with unnatural speed. His targeting runes flickered, struggling to get a lock through the turbulence. He thumbed the auto-cannon triggers, sending streams of tracer fire into the descent corridor. A few pods were hit, bursting apart midair, scattering burning wreckage across the night. But for every one destroyed, 10 more streaked past, unstoppable. Dagna's fighter blazed beside him, her guns carving a swath through the descent line. Further below, the planetary defense lines opened up, massive batteries firing flak bursts that filled the skies with lethal clouds. Explosions rippled like blooming flowers against the dark. Elias saw several pods detonate prematurely, torn apart by concentrated fire, but far too many survived. One of the pods slammed into the ground near the northern defense ridge, the impact sending a shockwave that Elias felt even from altitude. The pod cracked open like a black seed, and figures poured out. Even at this height, he recognized the distinct, hulking shapes, traitor Astartes. Their armor gleamed with the warped heraldry of long-dead legions, and their movements were precise, unstoppable. The first engagement on the ground began almost immediately, flashes of lasfire and the dull thud of artillery lighting the landscape. "Kale, eyes on the east ridge," Dagna snapped. "They're massing there." He banked hard, following her lead. On the Auspex, clusters of pods were converging on the eastern approach to Station Aegis, a calculated maneuver, not a random drop. They were forming a spearhead aimed directly at the defense wall. Elias' heart pounded. If they broke through there, the station would be encircled within hours. The surviving fighters rallied. A ragged half-squadron of Thunderbolts, 2 bombers whose payloads were nearly spent, and Elias and Dagna. It wasn't much, but it was what they had. They dove together through the smoke-choked clouds, engines howling, closing on the eastern ridge. Below them, the battle was escalating fast. The Imperial Guard lines were stretched thin, artillery batteries firing without pause. Elias saw ranks of infantry scrambling to reinforce the eastern wall, their lasguns flashing like starlight against the night. Chimera transports roared across the dirt, kicking up plumes of dust, while basilisk cannons boomed from the rear positions. But the enemy was already in the breach. Dozens of pods had landed intact, disgorging their twisted cargo. Chaos Marines advanced through the flaklit darkness with terrifying purpose. Bolters thundered, Traitor Guard troops swarmed behind them like a tide of vermin. Warp-twisted beasts stalked the flanks, their limbs too long, their eyes burning like embers. It was a vision straight from a nightmare, a coordinated, relentless assault that spoke of a commander with cold, strategic brilliance. Bombers hit the spearhead, fighters clear the skies, Dagna commanded. Elias broke from formation, targeting the lead wave of traitor armor pushing toward the wall. His lightning screamed low over the ridge, autocannons roaring, cutting into the enemy lines. Explosions rippled across the ground as his rounds slammed into corrupted transports and traitor infantry alike. A missile strike from the bombers followed, engulfing the spearhead in fire and smoke. For a heartbeat, the enemy advance faltered. But then they came again. The smoke parted, and a chaos dreadnought lumbered forward from the ruined pods. Its sarcophagus glowed with hateful energy, and its massive claws flexed like a predator scenting prey. Heavy bolters mounted on its torso opened up, tearing through the guard trenches with mechanical precision. Elias cursed, pulling up sharply to avoid the flak bursts from the enemy anti-air. "Kale, we need that thing down." Dagna's voice was iron. "I see it," he growled, circling back. His ammunition counters were low, dangerously low, but there was no choice. He lined up for another pass, diving straight at the dreadnought. The monster turned its guns skyward, belching streams of fire. Tracers stitched the air around him, a deadly net. He jinked hard, the lightning rattling like it was about to come apart, but he held the line. He squeezed the triggers. Every last round tore into the dreadnought's torso. The creature staggered, armor splintering under the concentrated barrage. A missile from one of the bombers struck a second later, punching through the weakened plating. The explosion was spectacular, a blooming fireball that consumed the dreadnought and scattered traitor troops like leaves in a gale. The eastern ridge trembled under the blast. Cheers crackled through the Vox, but they were short-lived. Elias' Auspex pinged new contacts, fast-moving, inbound from the upper atmosphere. He glanced up. A fresh wave of enemy fighters and warp beasts was descending, their silhouettes blotting out the stars. Reinforcements. The enemy wasn't just attacking from orbit anymore. They were reinforcing their ground push. "Marshal," Elias said, breathing hard, "we can't hold the skies like this. Not with what's coming." "I know," Dagna replied. There was no hesitation in her voice, just grim resolve. "But we hold anyway. Every minute counts. Station Aegis is evacuating civilian personnel to the sublevels. We buy them time or we die for nothing." The next engagement was chaos in its purest form. Dogfights erupted above the ridge as the battered Imperial squadron clashed with the incoming swarm. Elias found himself weaving between tracer lines and warp anomalies, every second a razor's edge between survival and death. A winged demon smashed into a thunderbolt beside him, tearing it in half midair. A chaos fighter dove at him, guns blazing. He rolled, countered, and tore it apart with a well-placed burst. On the ground, the enemy was pushing closer. The eastern wall was shrouded in smoke and fire, its battlements collapsing under constant bombardment. Elias saw flashes of melee combat, traitor Astartes tearing through guard lines, commissars rallying squads for desperate last stands, medics dragging the wounded back under shell fire. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a slow drowning. Through it all, Dagna's voice never faltered. She directed the fighters like a conductor in the middle of a storm, anticipating enemy movements, plugging holes in the defense line, calling out danger before anyone else could see it. Elias followed her commands without question. She was the only constant in the chaos. But even she couldn't change the tide forever. A deafening roar split the night. Elias' Auspex lit up with a massive energy surge. He scanned the ridge and saw it, an enormous drop pod, far larger than the rest, slamming into the battlefield like a meteor. Its hull was etched with symbols that made his eyes water just to look at them. The impact cratered the eastern approach, killing dozens instantly. The pod's locks hissed, its massive doors grinding open. Something stepped out. It was Astartes, yes, but wrong. A giant in Baroque, twisted armor, festooned with chains and trophies. A demon engine fused to a living warlord. His presence radiated malice so intense it made the air seem to curdle around him. Elias didn't know the name, but the reaction from the traitor forces said everything. They fell back, forming ranks around him. The enemy warlord had arrived. And with him, the real assault began. The eastern wall shook as warp artillery opened up from the enemy rear lines, coordinated barrages that smashed into the fortifications like tidal waves. The defenders scrambled, some fleeing, others digging in with a kind of fatalistic fury. The Vox filled with desperate cries for reinforcements that would never come. Elias' lightning soared overhead, low on ammo, nearly out of fuel but still flying. He watched as the warlord raised his massive weapon, a demon blade wreathed in writhing energy, and pointed it at the wall. The enemy surged forward like a living tide. The final act was beginning. The eastern wall was breaking. Elias could see it clearly even from the air, the way the stone and ferrocrete bulged under constant bombardment, how the crenellations were reduced to jagged silhouettes in the firelight. What had once been a proud bastion of Imperial engineering now looked like a wounded beast struggling to breathe. The defenders were exhausted, filthy, and bloodied, yet they clung to their positions with stubborn fury. Commissars stood atop broken barricades, las pistols raised, screaming orders into the din. Medici teams dragged the maimed to makeshift triage zones beneath shattered towers. Every trench was flooded with mud and blood, the ground churning beneath endless boots. Elias banked his lightning into another dive, strafing the enemy spearhead advancing beneath the command of the newly arrived warlord. His autocannons chattered weakly, every round precious now. He had long since spent his missiles and most of his munitions. His guns coughed rather than roared. Still, he refused to retreat. He lined up the shot carefully, hammering the advancing line of traitor guard and cultists. The front ranks disintegrated under his fire, but it was like trying to dam a river with his hands. On the ground, the warlord was a moving calamity. He strode through the carnage like a god of war, his demon blade drinking souls with every swing. Imperial lines crumpled before him. Heavy bolter teams tried to pin him down, only to be obliterated by return fire or torn apart by warp lightning emanating from the creature fused to his armor. He moved with unnatural grace for his size, each step deliberate, inevitable. "Kale," Dagna's voice cracked through the Vox, low and strained. "Pull back. You've got nothing left. You can't den him like this." Elias' knuckles whitened on the control stick. "I'm not leaving." "This isn't a choice," she snapped. "We regroup, we think we." Her voice cut out abruptly in a burst of static. Elias' heart lurched. He scanned the skies frantically, then caught sight of her lightning tumbling through the air, smoke trailing from its wing. A chaos fighter had clipped her during the last engagement. She was spinning toward the ground, fighting the controls to stabilize. "Dagna," he shouted. Her craft leveled out at the last moment, skimming just above the battlefield like a stone skipping across water. She managed to climb slightly, but she was wounded, bleeding altitude and fuel. Elias dove to cover her, circling back toward the eastern wall. The swarm of enemy fighters was thinning now, not because they had been defeated, but because their purpose had shifted. The ground assault was the main event, and the skies had become a secondary theater. Below, the eastern wall finally gave way. It started with a sound, a deep, resonant crack that seemed to ripple through the air. Then the entire central section of the wall collapsed inward in a tidal wave of rubble and smoke. The enemy surged through the breach like water through a shattered dam. Traitor guard, cultists, warp beasts, and chaos marines flooded into the gap, trampling the dead beneath their boots. Imperial defenders fired desperately, falling back in staggered lines, lasguns flashing in the night. "Station Aegis, this is Kale," Elias voxed. "The wall is down. Repeat, the wall is down. You need to pull your reserves now." The reply came from a weary, broken voice, an officer somewhere deep within the command bunker. "Reserves are gone, pilot. There's nothing left to pull. Hold if you can. Emperor protect you." The line cut. Elias stared at the broken wall, at the endless tide pouring through. A cold clarity settled over him. There would be no relief force, no cavalry riding in to save them. This was the end. But endings had power. Kale Dagna wheezed over Vox. Her voice was faint but alive. "I'm going down. West Trench line. Fuel's gone. Controls are shot. I'm done." "No," he said, forcing his lightning lower. "You're not done, not yet." Her laughter was bitter. "Listen to yourself. You sound like a fool. It's over. We both know it." He didn't answer because she was right. And yet he couldn't accept it. Not while his hand still held the stick. Not while he still had breath in his lungs. Below, he saw the warlord cutting his way through the defenders, drawing ever closer to the heart of Station Aegis. If that creature reached the command center, the entire garrison would fall in minutes. Elias' lightning was nearly spent, but it still had its engines, and its engines were fast. An idea sparked, a suicidal, desperate idea, but one that made sense in the kind of cold, brutal arithmetic that defined war in the 41st millennium. His gaze locked on the warlord, that towering figure moving through the breach like a living storm. He could end it here. Maybe not the invasion, maybe not the war, but this one thing. He throttled up, banking sharply, climbing into the night sky until the battlefield was a chaos of fire and smoke below him. His lightning's frame groaned in protest, fuel warnings blaring. But he ignored them. He leveled off, pointed the nose downward, and lined up his descent vector. The warlord was a speck in his canopy, but the targeting runes locked on with eerie precision. "Kale, what are you doing?" Dagna's voice came through, weak but sharp. "Ending it," he said. "Kale, don't." He cut the Vox. The lightning screamed downward, engines howling like a dying beast. The wind tore at the fuselage, the ground rushing up to meet him. Tracer fire lanced past as both Imperial and enemy forces realized what he was doing, too late to stop him. The warlord looked up, sensing the threat. Warp energy flared around him, but he couldn't move fast enough. Elias saw everything in that final moment with perfect clarity. The breach, the broken wall, the tide of enemies, the flickering defense lines, Dagna's crippled craft banking away, the endless night sky overhead. And at the center, the warlord, a nexus of hate and power. He aimed straight for it. Impact. The lightning struck like a thunderbolt, slamming into the warlord and the surrounding horde with the force of a small meteor. The explosion was immense, a blossom of fire and light that tore through the breach, incinerating everything within the radius. Shockwaves rippled across the battlefield, knocking soldiers from their feet, scattering debris for hundreds of meters. For a brief, blinding moment, the night was brighter than day. When the flames subsided, a crater gaped where the warlord had stood. The twisted remains of Elias' fighter were embedded deep in the earth. Around the crater, the enemy advance faltered. Traitor guards stumbled. Chaos Marines hesitated. Warp beasts shrieked and fled. The warlord was gone, obliterated in the conflagration. And in that hesitation, the defenders struck. Commissars bellowed, officers rallied what few troops remained, artillery crews redirected their fire. A counter-assault surged forward, driven by the desperate, furious knowledge that their pilot had given everything to buy them this moment. Above the battlefield, Dagna's damaged lightning limped toward the western hills. She watched the explosion through cracked canopy glass, tears cutting through the grime on her face. "Emperor guide you, Kale," she whispered. The battle for Station Aegis would continue for many hours more. The enemy would press, and the defenders would bleed. But something had changed. One act of defiance had torn a hole in the inevitable tide. And somewhere in the darkness, among the endless stars and fire, the name Elias Kale would be remembered, not as a hero who lived, but as a pilot who refused to let the end come quietly. The void was endless, the war eternal, but for one night one doomed existence burned so brightly that even the darkness hesitated.